Okay, it looks like we are live on Facebook. So hello, everybody, and we'll just leave it for a few minutes for people to join us.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Nicole. Is everyone good with letting our participants in?
Yep.
Okay.
Good for me.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our Beaty at Home. We're going to get started in about 3 minutes at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, if you'd like to tell us where you're joining us from, you can share that in the chat box. All right, Luke is joining us from Canada. Great. Has anyone been to the museum before? Okay, awesome. You've been to the museum. That's great. Awesome. So Rosalind, you're from Vancouver. Excellent. Welcome. Okay, so we've got 1 minute more to go. So we'll get started right at 1 o'clock. We're also streaming on Facebook. Hey, Arnold. Yeah, we miss our volunteers as well. It's been almost a year since we last had volunteers in the museum. So, hi, Gloria. You're local as well. It's great. Yeah. Our museum is open in person, but it's, you know, I'm glad that you're able to join us virtually as well. Oh, perfect. So Rosalind, you brought your students here at the museum. Excellent. And our BD at home today is all about evolution. Oh, the timeline of life. That's definitely one of my favorite things at the museum. Great. Okay, so I think we'll get started. So everybody, welcome again to our BD at home. Today we have a very special evolution-themed BD at home on the origin of species, Darwin's creatures. Last Friday, February 12th, was Charles Darwin's birthday. So this is in celebration of that. And today we're going to be taken around the museum by Angela Liu, who's a museum interpreter. She'll be the main presenter for the tour. My name is Kashfa. I'll be facilitating. We'll have lots of time for questions, so you can put your questions in the chat box. So I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to the Beaty Museum, and then I'll hand it over to Angela. So I wanted to start by telling you where the museum is. So we are on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. And you can see the Musqueam flag right in front of you, right there with the salmon on it. Here we are on a map. So we are right here on the campus of the University of British Columbia. We're next to lots of other museums like the Museum of Anthropology. We're next to we're close to the Botanical Garden, as well as the Pacific Museum of Earth, the Belkin Art Gallery. This is what the museum looks like from the outside. This is the biggest thing that we have at the museum, the blue whale. Right behind the museum, you can see this other building right here. This is the research center. So this is connected to the museum, and there are lots of scientists that do research in all aspects of biodiversity. So people studying ecology and evolution, taxonomy, and then this poster shows some of the organisms that people study. So there are scientists studying sunflowers, studying fish, seahorses, tropical plants, mushrooms, starfish, hummingbirds. So lots of interesting topics and interesting organisms. And this is a small sample of the cool things that we have here at the museum. So you can see quite a diversity in the kind of specimens that we have. We have over 2 million specimens in the museum. This is what the museum looks like on the inside. So we have lots and lots of rows of cabinets, and the cabinets are filled with specimens, parts of living things that are used by the researchers. So this is where the fish are kept, for example, and they're kept in all these different jars. These cabinets can be opened up by scientists, and they can look at the specimens up close. And the museum is organized by type of living thing, by collection. So I'll briefly walk you through each of them. This one on the top left is the Tetrapod Collection. Tetra means 4, pod means limb, arms, legs, wings. So anything with 4 limbs is a tetrapod. So this is represented here by a platypus skeleton. So you can see 4 limbs. This is the Marine Invertebrate Collection. Marine from the ocean, invertebrate without a backbone. So anything from the ocean without a backbone fits in this collection. It's represented by these beautiful abalone shells, which is a type of snail. This is the herbarium with plants and things that look like plants but are not plants, such as these mushrooms here, also lichen and so on. The entomology collection, which has insects and their close relatives, fish and fossils. So lots of really cool things to look at here at the museum. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Angela, who will be taking us on our tour. So Angela, you're ready?
I am. Can you see my video?
Yes, we can see your video, and I will spotlight it as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Angela. Thank you so much for joining me today on a lovely Wednesday afternoon for my Beaty at home. And thank you, Kashfa, for that fantastic introduction. So I hope everybody is doing well. And as Kashfa prefaced, that last week was Charles Darwin's birthday on February 12th. And many of us may know Darwin as often called the father of evolution, most notably for his famous publication of his well-known book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And this was his thesis where he depicted his postulations and evidence of natural selection and evolution in the mid-19th century. So another very notable naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, actually came to the same conclusion about evolution the same time Darwin did. And Wallace had sent Darwin his memoir about his findings, which matched Darwin's own. And this is actually said to be what really prompted Darwin or made him more eager to publish his theory and his book. And there has been some debate about whether Darwin has unfairly taken the credit for this theory of evolution. And there's a lot of interesting testimonies and reports and resources online, but I will not be talking too much about this situation here. But just to note that Wallace's birthday is on January 8th, so remember to give him a shout out as well. But for our tour today, I'll mostly be focusing on some of the travels of Charles Darwin himself and some of the species that he highlighted, not only in The Origin of Species, but also in his other works, either prior to his publication or after his publication, which all culminated in his argument about the theory of evolution. So today in our walk and talk, we'll be stepping inside the pages of Darwin's famous book to examine some of the really interesting species that Darwin studied, which ultimately led to his conclusion, which he announced in The Origin of Species. I do want to preface that I will not be going through all the chapters in chronological order or highlighting all the species that are within the book itself. As I said earlier, there's evolution is a massive topic. It's got endless trails, and the research is still ongoing and still fill in knowledge gaps. So I will try my best to give everybody a brief summary of what Charles Darwin has experienced and how he has come to his conclusion in the short time that we have today. I'm going to take a minute to situate ourselves here in the Discovery Lab, where we will be starting our walk and talk. My video is hopefully working well. All right. Give me a minute here. Is everybody able to see the Discovery Lab and not my face? Hopefully.
Yes, that looks good.
Nice. Lovely. Okay, fantastic. I want to start off here in the Discovery Lab where we house our education specimens. And this is a room where pre-COVID, we were able to take out a lot of really fascinating specimens to allow visitors to interact and touch and host a lot of really fun and interactive exhibits here. And I want to start off here in the very first chapter. So we're cracking open the book of the origin of species. And in the first chapter, Darwin makes note about domesticated species having much more variation and subspecies than those found in nature, particularly looking at the breeding of horses and other agricultural livestock or birds, which was quite a fad at that time. And this led him to argue that evolutionary factors were not the sole driver of speciation, but also the inheritance of traits from parents to offspring, such as in selective breeding. And this was particularly particularly from his experiments in looking at pigeons. So this magnificent bird we have right here, which is a rock pigeon. And by looking at pigeons, he studied the morphology of the crossbreeding of a lot of the different colorations of rock pigeons that were, some of them were white with red wingtips. And he studied that even though they have such different morphologies and colorations, they all were able to remain fertile after crossbreeding, indicating that they all originated from the same common ancestor. So the role of humans selecting for traits that best benefit us was the start or the spark of an idea of what he would later come to call natural selection, because he was able to apply this idea of perhaps humans selecting for these beneficial traits to what if nature was selecting for it instead. And a fun little fact, he actually conducted a lot of these experiments by himself in his own backyard by breeding pigeons and experimenting with different characteristics. And he did this so much that Darwin's friend even suggested that he publish a short book on pigeons due to his extensive experiments, and particularly because breeding pigeons was quite the craze back then in Victorian England, where the fancy breeds of the rock pigeon were quite aesthetic ornamental pets, I believe. All right, let's see if I can rotate my camera back up. So that's a chapter 1 of Darwin's famous book. And I thought it was an interesting way for him to begin his publication and his thesis by relating a common practice of selective breeding to his theory, which would be condemned as preposterous to many. So starting off his book by talking about selective breeding I thought was quite an interesting choice of his thesis. So in the next few chapters, Darwin begins to postulate the cause of speciation. And we will be stepping out into the museum floor. And as you can see, we have all of these rows and rows of cabinets here with us. And as Kashra mentioned, they house over 2 million specimens in the entire collection of our 6 of our main different collections. And we also have, if you ever do come visit us, we do have beautiful art exhibits on our walls around the year. And we actually have a new exhibit ongoing right now that call Fire Followers. So if you are able to drop by for a visit, I look forward to seeing everybody here. All right, I've made it up to the front of the museum. All right, oh, funny. Now in chapter 2, Darwin begins to refute the idea of divine creation, where each species is individually, which postulated the idea that each species was individually and independently formed. But if that were the case, there technically would be no reason for why there are variation of the same species. Therefore, the variation of species should be coming from environmental factors as well as inheritance of traits that were adapted to fit those environmental factors. And this supported this idea that different species actually came from one common ancestor. And above us right here, you see this gigantic skeleton of a blue. Did my mic hit something? Oh,
Oh,
apologies for that.
Oh, that's okay. We can hear you fine. There was, I think, a little bit of issue earlier, but it's all good.
Oh, sorry, I believe that was my zipper. All right, I will keep that in mind. Thanks for letting me know. All right, here we go with our museum blue whale. And the blue whale, although it lives in water and it does have a shape that we may often consider look a little bit like a fish, they're actually not fish. They're part of our Tetrapod collection. And if people remember what Kashfa has classified as a tetrapod, can anybody see maybe a feature that perhaps resemble a four-legged organism? It's a bit tricky to see actually, but I'll point this out right here. But we also want to think about how, because the blue whale is a tetrapod, it's actually also a mammal. What are some of the mammalian features of a blue whale? While you ponder about that, I do want to point out, if everybody can see those two little bones hanging off at the tail end over there, those are what we call the vestigial hip bones. The vestigial hip bones are really important remnants of what used to be a four-legged creature. Let's see here. So a lot of people actually recognized that whales were really similar to mammals than to any other group of animals by at least the 1700s, when Linnaeus, which was a famous classification biologist, classified living organisms for the first time and grouped whales with mammals. But it wasn't until Darwin and Wallace came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection and published on the origin of species in 1859 that people began to really widely understand the significance of these similarities. The interesting thing is, in the origin of species, Darwin actually said, and I quote, "I can see no difficulty in a race of bears becoming rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale." So critics actually interpreted this quote to say that, Darwin said that whales were related to bears, which was not the intention of Darwin. And he was so ridiculed that he eventually took out this paragraph from his book in later publications. But this speculation was definitely accurate in the relation of a whale to their mammalian ancestry. And I want to point out here, this is an artistic rendering of the Pachycetidus, or often known as the terrestrial whale, of a whale that lived around 50 million years ago on the shores of what we know today as Pakistan. And you can see that it's quite a interesting looking creature and vastly different from its current extant physiology. And this is only around a 1 to 2 meter long organism and a mammal, whereas we have a whopping 27 meter long marine mammal hanging above our heads right now. And since we're here, I also want to mention that later on in his book, Darwin talks about some of the challenges to his theory, some of the critiques that he received. And one of the major challenges was, why are there features on species that appear to have no evolutionary benefit? And one of them can be, for example, these vestigial features on the blue whale. And Darwin hypothesizes that these features could be vestiges of morphology from a time or habitat where they're no longer beneficial or not needed anymore, which is entirely accurate. He later said that the ancient whale was a transitional form. So these whales were often considered transitional forms in the evolution of modern day whales. Can anybody think about any of the vestigial features on humans, perhaps? What are some of the features that maybe humans have, but no longer really need? Any hypotheses? So, I'm seeing some answers, but I can't read them.
Yes, so Gloria says the little bit that used to be the third eyelid.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
I think I also.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I think I also saw one of the answers saying tail by Arnold. Was it right? Yeah, tailbone.
Yeah. Nicole suggested appendix.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm. I believe we also have a little structure in our ear that is also remnants of our more larger years as from our ape ancestors. But yeah, these are really fascinating structures that we currently have, but we don't really have a tail anymore, so we don't really need our tailbone. And a lot of the structures in our ear are also unnecessary. So vestigial features exist all around. Were you gonna add something on to that?
I was just going to add a question from Rosalind. What is the name of the blue whale terrestrial ancestor?
Oh, the Pachycetidus, I believe is the one that I showed. And it might be a little bit tricky of a spelling, so I don't know if Kasha wants to do a quick
I'll
shot
put
of that in the
it. I'll
chat.
put it in the chat.
Sweet. Okay. So here we are in the timeline of our museum, and I think I saw one of our participants mentioning this beautiful timeline as a highlight to their visit one time. But I want to continue a little bit about talking about some of the critiques that Darwin received, and he definitely received a lot, which addressed in this book. And one of them was, why isn't there immediate links between a current species and their ancestor? Now, we're all going to put on our scientist hats and try to come up with a hypothesis. So why can't naturalists from a while ago find these transitional fossils, as I would say? Or why can't they connect their modern day species to their ancestor? That was often the challenge to saying there is not a common ancestor, but independent species. Anybody have any idea? It's a bit of a tricky one. Darwin actually thought long and hard about this as well. And he found that from our knowledge today, we might be able to deduce this pretty efficiently after taking a little bit of investigation. But Darwin argued that it was because of the imperfections in the geological and fossil record. Yeah, I think I just saw an answer from Rosalind. Here's the gaps due to drastic climate events. That's absolutely correct. So these gaps in the geological record made it really difficult for naturalists looking for fossils, and still makes it really difficult for paleontologists today. And erosion, absolutely. So fossil preservation is a really tricky process. If anybody knows anything about paleontology, we still have a lot of the fossils we don't know whether they existed or ecosystems existed, mainly because we don't have a good preservation of them in our geological and fossil record. So furthermore, on Darwin's voyage to South America on his famous HMS Beagle ship, which we'll be talking a little bit about throughout our tour today, he read Charles Lyell's book on the principles of geology and gradual change through time. This was the beginning of him beginning to piece together how species could have perhaps been more connected and their origins more complex than the idea of divine creation that was prevalent at that time. So later he was able to connect his theory of evolution to Lyell's geological evolution, where land forms slowly and incrementally through time as well. So this is a really foundational step to his theory, because change through time is often not seen by the naked eye, of course. And a lot of this became critiques about how people were like, oh, why can't we see the evolution of the species? So in the next few chapters, Darwin begins to explain the basis of natural selection, the meat of his thesis, I will say, and how some characteristics do well and survive, and how some die out. So Darwin argues that, I'm just gonna come out here. Darwin argues that there are two main selective pressures, and one of them is a limited population increase. And this is an idea largely inspired by an economist called Thomas Malthus, who hypothesized that the geometric increase of population was ultimately limited by the arithmetic increase in food. So imagine the population shooting upwards while there is a linear increase in food supply. And the differential between these two curves was ultimately going to be the downfall of humanity. So a very grim economist. But Darwin began to interpolate that perhaps other selective pressures in natural variation in the environment, such as food availability, natural disasters, were the limitations of population increase. And therefore, he determined that this could drive the selection of traits that would allow individuals with traits that would allow them to better adapt, traits that would allow them to better survive in an environment where offspring of their traits would be passed down through time. One particular species that we may all be familiar with is actually Darwin's finches. And we may know that his discovery of these finches had looked at the adaptation of beak shapes to best allow for species to feed on specific food. And second, that these birds are actually all different species, even though they obviously originated from a common ancestor. So these birds are actually not finches. I don't think we have any finches here on the floor of our museum with us. But the finches were a really great example of adaptive radiation. So this fast diversification of species from a common ancestor to adapt to its surrounding environments. So while the finches were really important to his theory, I actually want to highlight two slightly less known species that Darwin was incredibly passionate about. And one of them, let me open this up here, is, can anybody guess? We're here in the Marine Invertebrate Collection. Just a little hint. Nicole, you got it. Barnacles. So one of them is barnacles. Darwin's famous voyage on the HMS Beagle led to the discovery of the Galapagos Islands, where he saw the finches and he collected multiple specimens to bring back to catalog. And he successfully were able to catalog all these specimens except one, the barnacle that he found. And this launched him into an extensive study of barnacles because he really wanted to not make assumptions about this specimen that he brought back. And he became inundated with more and more information about this fascinating arthropod as he compared species he took from the Galapagos to species he received from naturalists in Britain at that time. He dived into 8 whole years of study and became a leading authority of sorts in the field. And these studies were conducted several years prior to the origin of species, and his investigation and correspondence was actually one of his close botanist friends, really helped solidify his arguments for his eventual publication. So not many people would know that his fascination with arthropods and the fact that he came into the arthropod classification world and realized that it was quite a mess. He began to really clean up some of the classification and dive into categorizing, cataloging new species as well. I'm gonna set that aside. And this was several years prior to his publication, as I mentioned, but he was able to take a lot of his findings to solidify his argument and really allow him to find really good evidence for what he would like to argue later on. And then in 1857, he began to look into another species. So this leads into the second species I want to highlight. I hope my rustling isn't. Do you have any questions as I meander throughout?
Angela, Rosalind is asking, did he study these barnacles? Like, did he study barnacles this big?
I don't believe it was those particular barnacles. He studied a barnacle that, I know the name, but I can't remember it. It starts with an A. But he didn't study those particular barnacles. He studied the barnacles he discovered on the Galapagos Islands. So they were neotropical barnacles, likely, in that region. But that's a great question. So let's see if I can reach up there. Here we are in 1857, as I mentioned earlier. He published this book on insectivorous plants. In this book, he studied a particular species called the Sundew. So we have a specimen of a dried sundew here. It's a bit tricky to see, but we'll show a video shortly. And the sundew, or the Drosera, is a carnivorous plant that traps animals due to from their sticky glands on their leaf levers. It secretes acidic fluids to digest their prey. Kashfa, would you be able to show the video really shortly? We have a brief video that shows the fascination of the sundew. Oh, perfect. That looks great. Make note of the movement of this this particular lure as it begins to curl around the body of the fly that lands on it. And those little water droplet looking things are actually really sticky. It's made of a component that has sugar in it, which attracts the insect prey, but obviously leads to their eventual downfall, as you can see here. Perfect. Thank you so much. So in a letter to Asa Gray, an American botanist, Darwin actually said, "I care more about Drosera than the origin of all species. It's a wonderful plant, or rather, a most sagacious animal. I will stick up for the Drosera to the day of my death." So I gotta say, Darwin really was fascinated and passionate about this particular species.
Angela, I have a question.
Yeah.
So Gloria asks, where does the dissolved bug go? Does it get absorbed?
It does. I was actually getting right into that. So as we saw in the video, the plant bends and forms what we often, or scientists call an outer stomach, which engulfs and digests the captured insect. Carnivores plants, I'm just gonna scooch to the side here to allow some visitors to pass. Carnivores plants often tell a really fascinating story about the classification of plants and the fact that plants could have prey and could eat live insects was so preposterous that Darwin couldn't publish his book until several years later because he was scared to be labeled as insane, which was, I guess, a good consideration at that time. But carnivorous plants the origin of insectivorous plants actually was an adaptation to low nutrient soils. So the soils that they live on don't provide them with enough resources for them to thrive. So the plants begin to evolve these modified leaves where it traps insects for nutrients instead. They actually tell a really fascinating story about convergent evolution as well. Whereas it was found that different species of the pitcher plant around the world actually has the same digestive enzyme. And by comparing to the sundew, if you guys remember those little droplets at the end of the sundew tentacles, it was actually the same as well. So the fact that the species evolved this enzyme, even though they all independently evolved this enzyme, is what we call convergent evolution. And a really fascinating one at that. Alrighty. We're actually going to be heading in to the rest of our collection here. Here we are in our entomology collection. Give me a moment. So here, as we step into one of Darwin's closing chapters on instinct, I want to highlight a particular species that he was really fascinated with and spent a long time studying as well. And that is bees. So in this last chapter, Darwin looked at the instinct or the evolutionary or the evolution of instinct of an organism, their behavioral adaptations that allow them to better live within their community or live within their chosen niche and habitat. One particular species he discussed is how the behavior of bees in hive building is passed down through generations. To convince the natural theologians, so at that time, the people that believed that natural selection was not a thing, but rather all the species evolved independently and perfectly and were perfectly adapted for the environment because they were created by a divine being, were called natural theologians. And so to convince these natural theologians at that time, who believed that the complex organizational structure of hives, or this fascinating geometric and mathematical organization of these cells, or actually just the behavior of all animal species, were not the workings of a divine being, he had to strengthen this argument about how hive building behavior could have evolved incrementally over time. Fortunately, he found that the Melipona, which was a genus of neotropical bees, mostly made cylindrical cells. That's significant because the importance of cylindrical cells means that a long time or other species are able to create circular structures, which is considered a more simpler form of these hexagonal cells that we know today. And it was widely agreed that circular structures were easily made by animals. So he argued that if the Melipona bee were able to have, if they tended to stack their cells, it will likely develop to a similar shape as the hexagonal cells of the hives of honeybees. And he also conducted a series of other really extensive experiments about how these cells were built by allowing bees to dig through ridges of the wax wall, which I'll not dive too much into. But with this, he was able to argue that the instinct to build hexagonal cells originated from simpler and less organized circular cell building. And this is really important because he also was able to take this and apply it to other structures and other instinct of organisms, such as the migration of birds, for example. Now, as we turn to the final page of Darwin's famous publication, it's fascinating to see all the critics he has faced and how his book not only revolutionized the understanding of natural science in his time, but continues to direct pioneering knowledge as we look to describe new species. We are only able to cover species from, so we're actually able to cover species from each of our collections, except our fossil collection. But I want to note that Darwin conducted extensive studies in fossils, which were foundational to help him formulate his hypothesis. His discovery of skeletons in South America that resembled modern-day species allowed him to speculate that what if these fossils were actually the ancestors of animals we know today? There are also a plethora of other interesting facts and information about his life and his discoveries within the chapters of his book and some of his biographical, rewrites that we will place a bookmark on and close the book for now. However, it doesn't mean that this is where evolutionary theory ends. Here in our museum, we have researchers conducting a vast diversity of studies on evolutionary biology and their implications for the future of biodiversity. As much as Darwin and Wallace would have been able to predict and hypothesize about the past evolutionary history of our species, it's our job to protect their future. So one of the ways you can do that is through education and awareness, just by attending talks like this. And hopefully today, everybody was able to learn a little bit of something interesting, something new. And if you do have any questions, I'm really happy to take them, and I'm happy to cover any stories that I unfortunately had to leave out due to perceived time constraints.
Hey, Angela, that was really wonderful. A question from Rosalind. What are the brown lumps that you showed us?
Oh, that's a good one. I believe I glossed over that a little bit. So here we are in the fossil collection. I was talking a little bit about Darwin's discovery about ancient organisms, especially fossil skeletons that he found. These brown lumps, actually, does anybody have any ideas? What do they look like? Particularly that one and that one. Maybe those ones are really indicative ones.
We have a good guess. Denise says those were dinosaur tracks.
Yeah, exactly, Denise. So these were dinosaur tracks. There were actually two sets of dinosaur tracks. So this bottom one here with the slightly sharper toes, and it does resemble the footprint of a chicken, as one would say. This one, this middle one here, and this one, those belong to a theropod. And theropod dinosaurs are often carnivorous, and they look like this. And the rounder ones, if you see these ones here, those ones are from ornithopods, such as this one here. And ornithopod footprints are often from organisms that were either omnivorous or herbivorous.
Angela, this is a really good question about the tracks. Why are they protruding outwards?
Oh yes, that's a good point. So you can see that these footprints are not protruding, but these ones are, and that's because these ones are likely the inverse cast of a cast that would look like this if it wasn't on the other side of the soil. So they're only protruding because we're showing them from the bottom here. So if we were to flip this over, it would be the actual imprints of the footprint on top. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think there's a diagram too on the wall next to the map.
Here we go.
Yeah.
So it shows the imprint or the cast that it creates I'm stepping in the soil.
Great, thanks for sharing that. I'll just mention that earlier you were talking about convergent evolution, and there was just a comment over from Facebook saying that bats and birds are a nice example of convergent evolution.
Oh, absolutely. Bats, the evolution of flight in bats is definitely a feature that evolved independently and has converged through time. I believe we have a drawer for that somewhere. If you have any other questions. There's a lot of evidence of discoveries about the Myelodon, which was an ancient giant ground sloth by Darwin, which allowed him to hypothesize about whether this creature was the original ancestor of the common modern day sloth that we see in the tropics today. So the Myelodon is a really interesting organism if anybody wants to search up a picture of it too.
Is the Myelodon the giant ground sloth from North America?
It is.
The 6 meter tall one?
Absolutely, yeah, that's the one.
Wow, I did not know that Darwin had written about that.
He was, I think they were able to name one of the skeletons like Myelodon darwini, I believe. Maybe fact check me on that one.
Very neat. There's a question about the beehives. So how did Darwin get access to beehives from South America? The ones with the cylindricals?
Oh, that's a good question. So he was able to, I believe he had a lot of associates that are also studying natural biology, and he received a lot of samples from people around the world as well to further his work. This was also the case for his study of barnacles, which he was able to receive a lot of specimens from naturalists, not only in Britain, but I believe from other places in Europe. And because of his travels to North America, he could have also received specimens from his collection there.
And Nicole has added that his time on the Beagle, also when he was on the Beagle, he spent time in the Southern Hemisphere as well.
He did. He was able to discover a lot of fossils in South America. That was a particularly important finding of his. Myelodon, yep.
I'll share a photo of it. I found a link. The giant ground sloth is one of my personal favorite ancient extinct mammals. It is very huge and very interesting looking. So thank you for highlighting that, Angela.
Absolutely.
Gloria asks, were there any big setbacks during Darwin's research?
I believe there definitely were a lot of setbacks. One of the main ones was actually his deteriorating health at that time. And I believe he also faced a lot of backlash to his eventual publication, and he had to argue against. So his later publications began to add chapters to his original edition about him refuting different claims that people made against his theory of evolution. A lot of them were from natural theologians, and he had to battle a lot of the critiques of his time as well. I believe, I don't know if he experienced any difficulty in his research of the species. He was a gentleman explorer, so he was able to have quite a large amount of financial assets. So he lived comfortably, I believe, so he was able to access a lot of the specimens that he needed and the research tools that he did have. But that's a good question. I believe I didn't cover all of the challenges that he faced. I'm sure that during his many, many years of study and his dedication of his entire life's work, he would have faced a plethora of, or a myriad of different challenges and setbacks.
Sounds good. Do you know, Angela, so there's a question about the age of Darwin. How long did he live?
Oh, that's a good question. I should know this because I studied so much about him. I'm gonna double check. He was 73 years old.
Oh, yes, there we go.
Yes, from
Yes.
1809 to 1882.
Yeah. Angela, I was wondering, since you were close to the display bank, if you wanted to show us a certain fish specimen or fish fossil.
I did. I don't know if I was foreshadowing it earlier. For any of you who are still with us today, with us in the talk, I did have a particular fossil that I'm very fond of, and if anybody can, let's see if I can get rid of some of the glare. I don't know if I can with my poor cinematography skills.
Oh, we can see the outline of it.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So this is our great ancestor, as I would say. This is the coelacanth. And the coelacanth was a fish that roamed the waters around 375 million years ago. And the coelacanth was often considered a transitional fossil, or a fossil that, or a fish that began to show indications of evolution onto land, the terrestrialization of tetrapods. And this was because scientists found that the limbs of the coelacanth was very different from the fish, from the limbs of fish, the little fins. So if anybody has eaten fish or seen a little goldfish, you'll see that their fins are really flappy and thin. But the coelacanth has really fleshy lobe-like fins. And these were hypothesized to the beginnings of evolution of limbs, or forearms and legs. And the coelacanth is in the group called Sarcopterygiae, which one of the other fish in that group was the lungfish, which had proto-lungs that were hypothesized to, were able to adapt to breathing oxygen rather than dissolved oxygen that the fish breathe. And we see a little fossil on the side here called the Tiktaalik, and you may see some of the holes on top of their skull. And this was the fish that came, I guess simply put, came after the coelacanth. And you can see that the holes on the top of their heads were actually places for the eyes, which allowed them to peek their heads out of the water. The beginnings of terrestrialization of tetrapods is a really fascinating and arduous process to explain, but it's really interesting to see how our great ancestor, or humans technically, are just really fancy fish. I did
like
see
that
some questions fly by.
Yeah. I did want to just mention a comment from Denise that contradicting religious beliefs and Darwin's wife's strong religion caused him great difficulties.
That is true. So that is one of the main points as well. And I think one of the main things that actually caused him to deny Christianity at his time was when he came back from his explorations, the death of one of his oldest daughters was really impactful on his well-being. And I believe that really allowed him to believe that, or he became in a really depressive state, which I think made him lose a lot of his faith. That was one of the factors, I guess, that influenced his research and his background there.
Arnold's asking, did Darwin also research on species closer to humans, or are those mostly from other scientists?
Oh, like hominids? I am unsure. I'm actually not certain if he did study hominids. I believe a lot of his studies were based from specimens he collected on his travels, which I don't think he collected much hominid skulls or ape skulls. I think he did collect some monkey specimens, but I don't know if he looked into the direct ancestry of humans. That's a great question. I would like to look. I think that's definitely a route that I should look into.
Great. Rosalind is asking if you know whether the Tiktaalik fossil has been found anywhere else other than Nunavut in Canada?
Oh, I'm sure it should have been found in other places. I'm unsure about that.
I'm doing a quick search online, and it looks like so far it's just Canada.
Oh, fascinating.
And looks like there were 3 skeletons that were found.
Ah, also I saw a note from Rosalind that yes, he did study monkeys, and yeah, that definitely makes sense that he would connect it to be either the origin or the cousin of humans, and it would make even more sense that he got ridiculed for this, especially during his time.
Yeah.
And the coelacanth actually is not a extinct organism, as I may have implied. They were able to find a specimen in around 1960s, I believe, on the coast of I guess Southeast Asia, and it's an endangered species now because there's so little numbers of it, but they still swim about. They're still swimming about in the tropical oceans.
Just a few comments. So Arnold's saying it's fascinating to hear about his studies on many different organisms, because when people normally imagine evolution, it's that diagram of an ape becoming a human. So.
That's absolutely true. His study on the diversity of organisms really made him a fantastic naturalist, because he was able to accumulate so much evidence over his time to make his arguments incredibly strong that was able to be difficult to refute even in his time. So his work was definitely foundational and revolutionary at the time.
For sure. All right, folks, if you have any last questions, any last thing you'd like to share, you can do so. I'll just share a comment from Facebook. Tim says, at the time, religion insisted that animals were created fully formed, which evolution by gradual and slow change directly challenged.
Exactly. So that was one of the points I was talking about when he was trying to make his argument for the structure of bees and the evolution of species such as finches, because they were argued that the natural theologians at that time argued that species were made perfect, basically, made perfectly adapted, and were all independently created for their different ecosystems and environments, which was definitely not the case, because therefore that would not explain why there are variations of the same species, which Darwin talked about and refuted in his theory of evolution.
Wonderful. All right. Denise has just added that there used to be a coelacanth at the aquarium.
Ooh.
Or a preserved one. Yes, I remember seeing it a couple of years ago, but I don't know about recently. And the aquarium is also it's no longer open to the public, but I also remember seeing that, Denise.
Super neat. I wish I had been in Vancouver at that time.
Oh, okay. So, all right. I think, Angela, is this a good time to wrap up then?
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Kashpa.
Awesome. So thank you everybody for joining us. We do these Beaty at Home programs every Wednesday. So next Wednesday at 1 p.m. we'll have a museum tour with Nancy, who's one of our interpreters. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. So we have lots of thank yous in the comments.
Oh, fantastic. I'm glad everybody was having an interesting talk today.
Awesome.
Thanks, Gloria.
So Rosalind, you can sign up for that one on our museum page. Yeah, you can sign up for each one individually. All right. Awesome. Thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us.